April 16, 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing, but for 3 German nurses, the nightmare was just beginning. In a battered field hospital near Oldenburg, northwest Germany, Margaret Hoffman stood at a window, her hands trembling as she watched Canadian soldiers surround the building. The sun had risen, but there was no warmth, only the cold grip of fear. For Margaret, every rumor, every warning, every terrifying story she'd ever heard about the enemy was about to become real. Margaret was no stranger to war. At 34, she'd spent 12 years as a military nurse, rising to become head nurse in a world where loyalty to the Nazi Party was demanded, not requested. She believed everything she'd been told, and what she'd been told over and over was that the enemy, especially the Canadians and Americans, were monsters. The Nazi propaganda machine had worked overtime, flooding every meeting, every briefing, every quiet moment with the same chilling message. If you're captured, you'll be tortured. You'll be humiliated. You'll be killed simply for doing your duty. It wasn't just talk. Propaganda officers visited the nurses regularly, repeating the same threats until they became gospel. The Canadians will show no mercy, they said. They'll punish you for helping German soldiers. They'll do things so terrible you'll wish you never been born. The warnings were relentless, and after months of hearing them, Margaret and her colleagues believed every word. The fear was so real, so deeply rooted, that Margaret made her own preparations. She told the other nurses to hide poison pills in their pockets, one last desperate option if the enemy broke through. Better to die quickly, she thought, than face the horrors she'd been promised. Standing beside Margaret was Elise Bauer, just 22 years old, drafted into service only 8 months earlier. Elise had grown up on a quiet farm in Bavaria, far from the front lines, far from politics. She didn't care about ideology, she just wanted to help people and go home. But now, surrounded by wounded soldiers and the echo of propaganda, she was shaking with fear. The stories she'd heard about the Americans and Canadians haunted her. She was convinced this was the end. Across the room, Anna Zimmerman tried to hold back tears. At 19, she was barely more than a child, her life already shattered by war. Her father had died fighting in Russia. Her mother had vanished in the chaos of Berlin's destruction. Anna had joined the medical service to escape factory work, but she received almost no training, just enough to survive. She didn't trust the Nazi Party, not after everything she'd lost. But even Anna, skeptical and scarred, believed the enemy would kill her. The propaganda had done its job. Inside that hospital, fear was a living thing. It crept through the halls, whispered in the dark, and pressed down on every heart. The nurses clung to their hidden pills, convinced that death was better than capture. They waited for the sound of boots, the crash of doors, the violence they'd been promised. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. But here's the twist. Everything they believed was about to be tested. The world outside was changing fast. The American and Canadian armies were advancing. The Nazi regime was crumbling, and the old certainties were falling apart. For Margaret, Elise, and Anna, the next few hours would shatter everything they thought they knew, not just about the enemy, but about themselves, their country, and the truth itself. What happens when propaganda meets reality? For these 3 women, the answer would be more shocking than anything they'd ever imagined. And as the Canadian officer approached the hospital, carrying a white flag, none of them could have guessed how their story would change, not just for them, but for history itself. But that was only the beginning. The moment the Canadian officer stepped out of the morning mist, everything the nurses thought they knew about war was put to the ultimate test. Margaret's heart pounded as she watched him approach, a white flag in his hand, a symbol she'd been taught to distrust. The propaganda had always insisted that the enemy would use tricks, that any sign of mercy was just a trap. But now, with the war's end so close, the line between truth and lies was about to blur forever. Inside the hospital, the tension was suffocating. Margaret burned patient records in the stove, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the matches. Elise clutched her hidden pill, her mind racing with every horror story she'd ever heard. Anna stared at the floor, convinced that the end was near. The wounded German soldiers, too weak to move, watched in silence, their faces pale with dread. Every person in that building was bracing for violence. But when the Canadian lieutenant finally entered, the world seemed to pause. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't shout or threaten. Instead, he looked around the room, taking in the wounded men and the exhausted nurses. Then, in clear, careful German, he said something that none of them expected. "You're still nurses. Medical personnel are protected under the Geneva Convention. You will continue to care for these patients until we arrange transport." For a moment, nobody moved. Margaret's mind raced. Was this a trick? The Nazi officers had always said the Allies ignored the rules of war. They'd warned that the Geneva Convention was just a piece of paper, meaningless in the face of real hatred. But here was the enemy, speaking calmly, offering protection, not punishment. The Canadian soldiers didn't storm the hospital. They didn't separate the staff or interrogate anyone. Instead, they brought food, real food, the kind the nurses hadn't seen in years. White bread, soft and fresh. Butter, thick and golden. Canned meat that actually tasted like meat. Each nurse received a portion so generous it felt like a feast. For months, they'd survived on watery soup and stale crusts. Now suddenly, they were being fed like honored guests. Elise stared at her plate, unable to believe her eyes. Anna slipped a piece of bread into her pocket, half convinced it was all a cruel joke. "Why would they feed us before killing us?" she whispered. "Are they fattening us up like animals before the slaughter?" The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion. Nothing made sense anymore. That night the nurses whispered in the darkness, their voices barely above a breath. "Tomorrow they'll move us to a processing center," Margaret said. "That's when the torture begins. That's what we were told." Elise wondered if they should try to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The German army was collapsing. The war was almost over. Anna considered taking her hidden pill before things got worse. None of them slept. Every sound outside made them flinch. But the next morning the Canadians returned, not with guns but with breakfast. More bread, more butter, more meat. The soldiers were polite, calling the nurses miss and holding doors open. When Margaret dropped a bandage, a Canadian private picked it up and handed it back with a smile. "Here you go," he said in broken German. Elise whispered to Anna, "They're being polite. I don't understand why." For 2 days, the Canadians let the nurses do their jobs. No one was hit. No one was questioned about military secrets. No one was touched in any way that felt threatening. The propaganda had painted the Allies as monsters, but these soldiers seemed to have more rules and more humanity than the German army ever did. When the time came to move the nurses, Margaret braced herself for the worst. She expected cattle cars, the kind used to transport prisoners. Instead, the Canadians loaded them into covered trucks with seats and canvas sides so they could see the countryside. The guards riding with them were women, members of the Canadian Women's Army Corps. One even offered cigarettes. Margaret refused, certain they were poison, but Anna accepted. Nothing happened. As the trucks rolled through the German countryside, the nurses saw things that shattered their old beliefs. Canadian supply depots stacked with food and medicine. Soldiers who looked healthy and strong, not desperate or starving. New trucks that ran smoothly, unlike the broken-down vehicles of the German army. Elise whispered, "If they wanted to kill us, why waste all this food and fuel moving us around?" Every mile, every meal, every act of kindness chipped away at the lies they'd been told. The enemy wasn't starving. The enemy wasn't desperate. The enemy wasn't cruel. The enemy had already won, and they didn't need to prove their strength through violence. For Margaret, Elise, and Anna, the world was turning upside down. Everything they'd believed about the Americans and Canadians was unraveling. The truth was more powerful and more unsettling than any propaganda. And as the trucks carried them toward an unknown future, one question echoed in their minds. If the enemy isn't a monster, then what else have we been wrong about? But the journey was far from over. What waited for them across the ocean would challenge everything they thought they knew about war, about mercy, and about themselves. As the convoy of trucks rolled deeper into Allied-controlled territory, the world outside the canvas flaps looked nothing like the war-torn Germany the nurses had left behind. For Margaret, Elise, and Anna, every mile brought a new shock, a new crack in the wall of propaganda that had shaped their lives. The further they traveled, the more impossible it became to hold onto the old beliefs. The first jolt came at the Canadian supply depots. Towering stacks of crates, food, medicine, fuel, rose 4 meters high, guarded by soldiers who looked nothing like the desperate, starving enemy they'd been warned about. These men were strong, well-fed, and relaxed, laughing and joking as they unloaded supplies. Elise watched them through the truck's canvas window, her mind racing. "They look healthier than any German soldier I've ever seen," she whispered. "How is that possible?" The answer was obvious, but it was one she'd never been allowed to consider. The Allies weren't losing. They were thriving. The trucks themselves were another revelation. They were new, clean, and ran smoothly, a world apart from the battered, smoke-belching vehicles of the German army. Anna couldn't help but notice the difference. "Our trucks always broke down," she muttered. "These just keep going." Every detail, every observation was a reminder that the enemy was not the ragged, desperate force she'd been taught to fear. Instead, they were organized, efficient, and most unsettling of all kind. But the real culture shock began when the nurses reached the French coast. There waiting for them was a ship unlike anything they'd imagined. The HMS Letitia, once a luxury passenger liner now painted white with red crosses, gleamed in the harbor. Margaret braced herself for the worst, expecting to be herded into dark, filthy cargo holds. Instead, the Canadian guards led them to real passenger cabins, 8 beds to a room, each with a mattress and clean sheets. There were toilets that flushed, sinks with running water, and even a female doctor who examined each nurse with professionalism and respect. For 10 days, the nurses crossed the Atlantic, processing everything they'd seen. The ship was a floating contradiction, a place of safety and order in a world that had been nothing but chaos. The Canadian staff treated the German nurses as medical professionals, not as enemies. They were given regular meals, 3 times a day, each plate piled high with bread, butter, meat, and even fruit. Anna stared at an orange on her breakfast tray, unable to remember the last time she'd seen such a thing. "How can they feed us like this if their country is starving from the war?" she wondered aloud. The answer was clear every time she looked out the porthole and saw the endless, untouched ocean. The war had never reached Canada's shores. When the ship finally docked in Halifax, the nurses stepped into a world that felt almost unreal. The city was bright and bustling, its docks lined with ships and warehouses, its streets filled with people who looked healthy and unafraid. Electric lights glowed everywhere. There were no bombed-out buildings, no piles of rubble, no signs of war. Elise pressed her face to the train window as they traveled west, watching forests, lakes, and cities pass by, each one more intact and peaceful than the last. In Montreal, she saw children playing in parks, their laughter echoing through streets untouched by violence. The journey across Canada was a revelation. Every meal was a reminder of abundance, real coffee, fresh bread, fruit, and meat. Anna weighed herself and realized she gained 8 kilograms in a single month. Her body was remembering what it felt like to be nourished. Elise wrote home to Bavaria telling her parents, "I eat 3 times every day. Real meat, vegetables, I am no longer hungry." She didn't know if her family would ever read the letter, but she needed to say it out loud. The enemy was feeding her better than her own country ever had. At Medicine Hat, the culture shock only deepened. The POW camp was nothing like the prisons they'd imagined. There were heated buildings, real beds, running water, and even a library filled with German books. The activities building had a piano, a radio, and supplies for crafts. The Canadian guards were polite, the rules were clear, and the nurses were treated with dignity. For Margaret, it was almost too much to process. In the German army, soldiers got punished for the smallest mistakes, she thought. Here, prisoners get pianos. But the biggest shock came when the camp commander, Major William Preston, offered the nurses a choice: work at the local hospital, earn money, and help care for Canadian patients. It was voluntary. It came with better food and more freedom. For the first time, Margaret, Elise, and Anna were being asked, not ordered, to use their skills. They were being treated as professionals, not as enemies. Every day in Canada was a lesson in contradiction. The propaganda had promised cruelty, starvation, and death. The reality was respect, abundance, and a chance to heal. The old world was gone, and a new one was taking its place, one where kindness was stronger than fear, and truth was more powerful than any lie. But as the nurses settled into their new lives, one question haunted them. If everything they'd been taught about the enemy was wrong, what else had been a lie? And what would happen when they finally returned to a Germany that no longer existed? The answers would change their lives and history forever. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out like a gray, endless wall, separating everything the nurses had ever known from a future they couldn't imagine. For Margaret, Elise, and Anna, the journey from war-torn Europe to the safety of North America was more than just a change in geography. It was a crossing into a new reality, one that would challenge every belief they'd ever held. As the HMS Laetitia pulled away from the French coast, the nurses stood on the deck, staring at the vast expanse of water. None of them had ever seen the ocean before. To them, it was both a barrier and a promise, a line between the world of destruction they were leaving behind and the unknown that waited ahead. The ship itself was a marvel, once a luxury liner now transformed into a hospital ship, painted white with bold red crosses. It was a floating symbol of hope, but also a source of anxiety. Margaret couldn't shake the suspicion that this was all a trick, that the Canadians would reveal their true intentions once the ship was far from land. But as the days passed, the reality on board was nothing like the nightmares they'd been warned about. The Canadian guards were professional and respectful. The nurses were given real cabins, with beds that had actual mattresses and clean sheets. There were toilets that flushed, sinks with running water, and even a female doctor who checked on each of them. The food was plentiful, 3 meals a day, with bread, butter, meat, and fruit. For women who had survived on starvation rations, it felt almost surreal. Anna found herself staring at an orange on her breakfast tray, unable to believe it was real. She hadn't seen a citrus fruit since she was a child, before the war had turned everything upside down. Elise wrote in her notebook, "We are being treated like people, not prisoners. I don't understand it." Margaret, ever the skeptic, kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Why give us medical exams if they plan to kill us? She wondered. Why waste food on the enemy? The days at sea were filled with questions and quiet conversations. The nurses talked in hushed voices, trying to make sense of their new reality. They watched the Canadian staff move through their routines, efficient, calm, and always polite. There were no interrogations, no threats, no punishments. Instead, there was a sense of order and decency that felt almost alien after years of chaos. As the ship neared the Canadian coast, the nurses' anxiety grew. What would happen when they arrived? Would the kindness end? Would they be separated, interrogated, or sent to some distant camp? The propaganda they'd grown up with still echoed in their minds, warning them not to trust the enemy. But every day, those warnings seemed more and more hollow. When the Laetitia finally docked in Halifax, the nurses stepped onto Canadian soil for the first time. The city was a revelation, intact, bustling, and full of life. There were no bombed-out buildings, no rubble, no signs of war. Electric lights glowed everywhere, and the air was filled with the sounds of a country untouched by conflict. For Margaret, Elise, and Anna, it was like stepping into another world. The Canadian authorities processed the nurses with paperwork and photographs, giving each woman a prisoner of war card. They were assigned to a transport unit bound for Medicine Hat, Alberta, a name that sounded as foreign as the landscape around them. The train that carried them west was clean, heated, and comfortable, with real seats and regular meals. As the miles rolled by, the nurses watched forests, lakes, and cities pass outside the windows. Elise wrote in her notebook, "No ruins, no hunger. Children playing in parks. Is this what peace looks like?" Every detail was a shock. The abundance of food, the kindness of strangers, the sense of safety. Anna weighed herself and realized she'd gained weight for the first time in years. Elise marveled at the endless forests and the vast, open sky. Margaret, still wary, kept her thoughts to herself, but even she couldn't deny the evidence in front of her eyes. The journey across Canada was more than just a physical crossing. It was a transformation. The nurses were no longer just prisoners. They were witnesses to a different way of life. The propaganda that had shaped their fears was crumbling, replaced by the undeniable reality of kindness and abundance. But as the train approached Medicine Hat, one question lingered in their minds. What would happen next? Would this new world continue to defy their expectations, or would the old fears finally come true? The answers were waiting for them in the heart of Canada, where their journey and their transformation was only just beginning. When the train finally rolled into Medicine Hat, Alberta, Margaret, Elise, and Anna stepped into a world that felt more like a dream than reality. The Canadian prairies stretched out under a wide, endless sky, and the air was crisp and clean. For three women who had survived the ruins of Europe, it was almost impossible to believe this place existed. But the real shock was still waiting for them inside the gates of the Medicine Hat POW camp. From the outside, the camp looked ordinary, rows of wooden buildings surrounded by fences. But inside, everything was different from what the nurses had been taught to expect. Each woman was given her own metal bed with a real mattress, a blanket, and a pillow. The barracks were heated, the walls were solid, and the bathrooms had running water and toilets that flushed. There was even a building just for activities, with a library full of German books, a radio that played music, and a piano in the corner. For Margaret, it was almost too much to process. In the German army, soldiers got punished for the smallest mistakes, she thought. Here, prisoners get pianos. But the biggest surprise came the next morning when the camp commander, Major William Preston, gathered the 27 German nurses together. He was a tall man from Calgary with a calm voice and steady eyes. "We have a problem," he said. "The hospital in Medicine Hat doesn't have enough nurses. Many Canadian nurses are overseas helping with the war. We need medical help." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Would you be willing to work at the hospital under supervision? The work is voluntary. You'll be paid 50 cents a day. You'll get better food and more freedom." For a moment the room was silent. The idea was unthinkable, German nurses working in a Canadian hospital, caring for the enemy's sick and wounded. Margaret felt her world tilt sideways. She had spent years believing that Canadians were cruel, that they would never trust a German, let alone treat one as an equal. But now, she was being offered a chance to use her skills, not as a prisoner, but as a nurse. Elise was the first to raise her hand. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. Anna followed, but she couldn't help asking, "What's the trick? What do you really want from us?" Major Preston shook his head. "No trick, we need nurses. You are nurses. You'll work with Canadian supervisors, that's all." 6 days later, 6 German nurses, including Margaret, Elise, and Anna, walked through the doors of Medicine Hat General Hospital. The building was bright and clean, filled with the smell of soap and fresh linens. The head nurse, Catherine Ross, was a tough, no-nonsense woman from Saskatchewan. She assigned each German nurse to a different part of the hospital. Elise to the children's wing, Anna to surgery, Margaret to maternity. For the first time, the women found themselves caring for Canadian patients. Children, mothers, soldiers, people they had been taught to hate. The Canadian staff treated the German nurses like colleagues, not enemies. They answered questions, shared supplies, and even taught them new techniques. The hospital had medicine everywhere, bottles and bottles of it. There were clean bandages, working X-ray machines, and refrigerators to keep medicine cold. Margaret wrote in her diary, May 15th. "I dressed the wounds of an enemy soldier today. He thanked me. He called me nurse. Not a bad name. What is this place?" Over the next 3 months, the nurses discovered more impossible things. The hospital cafeteria let them eat as much as they wanted, unlimited bread, butter, milk, and real meat. Anna stepped on a scale in June and realized she gained 8 kilograms in just 1 month. Her body was remembering what it felt like to be healthy. Elise wrote a letter home. "Mother, I eat 3 times every day. Real meat, vegetables. I am no longer hungry." She didn't know if her parents were alive to read it, but she needed to share the truth. The kindness didn't stop at food. A patient's grandmother knitted a scarf for Margaret as a thank-you gift. Anna became friends with a Canadian nurse who taught her English words. Elise helped a doctor with a complicated surgery and was trusted with important tasks. Every day, the German nurses learned something new, not just about medicine, but about trust, respect, and the power of compassion. But not everyone in the camp was ready to accept this new reality. Some prisoners clung to old beliefs, calling the nurses traitors for working with the enemy. Arguments broke out in the barracks. Margaret was torn in half. Everything she had been taught said Canada was weak and cruel, but every single day showed her the opposite. Anna wrote in a letter she never sent, "We were told they were monsters. They treat us better than our own army did." As summer turned to fall, the nurses realized that their lives had changed forever. They had crossed an ocean, survived a war, and found humanity in the most unexpected place. The propaganda that once ruled their minds was fading, replaced by something stronger, the truth they had seen with their own eyes. But even as they found a new sense of purpose in Canada, one question remained. What would happen when they returned to Germany, carrying a truth their country might not want to hear? The answer would test their courage in ways the war never could. As the months passed in Medicine Hat, the German nurses found themselves living a reality that would have been unthinkable just a year before. The war in Europe was over, but inside the camp, a different kind of battle was raging, a battle for the truth. For Margaret, Elise, and Anna, the hardest fight wasn't against hunger or fear, but against the beliefs that had been drilled into them since childhood. The turning point came on a cold December morning. Christmas in Canada was nothing like Christmas in Germany. The hospital cafeteria was decorated with a sparkling tree, paper chains, and candles on every table. The air was filled with the scent of pine, cinnamon, and fresh coffee. Canadian nurses and doctors invited the German prisoners to join the celebration. At first, Margaret refused. "It's wrong to celebrate with the enemy," she told Elise. But Elise shook her head. "They're not treating us like enemies. Why should we treat them that way?" Margaret finally agreed to go, promising herself she wouldn't enjoy it. But as she sat at the end of the table, watching Elise laugh with a Canadian nurse and Anna help carry food, she felt her resolve slipping. The meal was a feast: turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, 3 kinds of pie, and even wine. Margaret hadn't eaten like this since before the war. When the head nurse, Catherine Ross, stood up to make a toast, she raised her glass to our German colleagues who have helped us save lives this year. The room erupted in applause. Margaret's face burned with emotion. Then Dr. James Murphy, a surgeon whose brother had died fighting Germans on D-Day, approached her. "Nurse Hoffman," he said, "I want to thank you for helping me in surgery these past months. You are one of the finest nurses I have ever worked with." Margaret stared at his outstretched hand, unable to move. This man had every reason to hate her, yet here he was, offering respect and gratitude. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of 8 months of confusion and crumbling beliefs crashed over her. She fled the cafeteria, the cold night air biting at her skin as she stood outside, staring at the stars. Elise found her there, silent and shivering. "Everything I believed was lies," Margaret whispered. "They told us the Canadians would torture us and kill us. They told us we were superior and they were weak. They told us cruelty was strength. It was all lies, Elise, all of it." Elise put her arm around Margaret's shoulders. "Yes," she said quietly, "and we survived long enough to learn the truth." Anna joined them, carrying their coats. "What happens when we go home to Germany?" she asked. None of them had an answer. They knew the truth they had learned in Canada would not be welcome in a country still reeling from defeat and destruction. People who still believed the Nazi lies would call them traitors. People who had lost everything would resent them for surviving in comfort while others starved. The truth was both a gift and a burden. Inside the hospital, someone played Silent Night on the piano. The melody drifted out into the snowy night, first in English, then in German. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked up at the stars. She realized she was not the same person who had been captured 8 months earlier. That woman had believed in propaganda and followed orders without question. This woman knew what kindness looked like, what real strength was, and the difference between lies and truth. She would never be the same again. The days after Christmas brought new challenges. Some of the German prisoners clung to old beliefs, calling Margaret and the others traitors for working with the Canadians. Frau Kessler, whose husband had been a Wehrmacht officer, kept a picture of Hitler hidden under her mattress and refused to work at the hospital. "You shame Germany by working for the enemy," she told Margaret, but Margaret was done with lies. "I shame Germany by denying the truth," she replied. The camp split into factions. About 30 women stayed loyal to Nazi ideas, refusing to accept what they saw with their own eyes. 60 just wanted to survive and go home. 22, including Margaret, Elise, and Anna, openly admitted that everything they had been taught was wrong. The cafeteria became a battleground of ideas, with each group sitting at separate tables. Margaret threw herself into learning English, asking Catherine Ross endless questions about Canadian life. "How did you resist propaganda during the war?" she asked. Catherine explained, "We had education. We had newspapers that could print different opinions. We could question our leaders without being arrested. Your government took all of that away from you." For Margaret, it was a revelation. Freedom wasn't weakness, it was the strength to see the truth. Elise became a bridge between the groups, teaching English classes to anyone who wanted to learn, even those who still clung to old beliefs. She started writing letters to a Canadian family she'd met at the hospital, visiting their farm for Sunday dinners and dreaming of a future where she could teach nursing the right way. Anna, meanwhile, channeled her anger into work, volunteering for extra shifts and learning English faster than anyone else. "I couldn't save Germany," she said, "but I can save lives here. That has to mean something." Each woman found her own way to heal, but all three knew that the hardest test was still ahead. They had broken free from the lies that once controlled them, but what would happen when they returned to a country that might not want to hear the truth? The answer would shape not only their futures, but the future of everyone who had survived the war. By the fall of 1946, the world had changed, but for Margaret, Elise, and Anna, the most difficult journey was still ahead. After more than a year in Canada, the official orders finally arrived. All German prisoners would be sent home. The news swept through the Medicine Hat camp like a cold wind. Some women cheered, desperate to see their families again. Others felt only dread. For Margaret, Elise, and Anna, the thought of returning to Germany was both a relief and a new kind of fear. The last days in Canada were bittersweet. The Canadian staff at Medicine Hat General Hospital threw a farewell party for the German nurses. Catherine Ross, the head nurse who had become a mentor and friend, handed out gifts, medical textbooks, bandages, and personal letters. Dr. Murphy gave Elise a letter of recommendation, stamped with the hospital seal. Anna received a handwritten cookbook from the hospital cooks, filled with recipes for the meals she'd come to love. The nurses packed their few belongings, choosing carefully what to take: letters, photos, and the small treasures that reminded them of kindness in a foreign land. On October 15th, the train left Medicine Hat, heading east across the vast Canadian landscape. Elise pressed her face to the window, watching the forests and lakes slip by. "I am leaving the first place that ever treated me like a human being instead of a tool," she whispered. Anna stared at the farms and cities, wondering if Germany would ever look like this again, peaceful, undamaged, alive. Margaret wrote in her diary, "We are going from abundance to hell." The ship that carried them back across the Atlantic was no hospital ship this time. The SS Marine Raven was a converted cargo vessel, crowded and basic, but the food was enough and the journey safe. As they crossed the ocean, news crackled over the radio: Nuremberg trials, war crime sentences, warnings of a brutal winter in Germany. The women who still clung to Nazi beliefs were eager to return, convinced that Germany would rise again. But for Margaret, Elise, and Anna, the future felt uncertain and heavy. When the ship docked at Bremerhaven, the nurses stepped onto German soil for the first time in 18 months. The sight that greeted them was devastating. The port was a landscape of ruins, mountains of rubble, broken buildings, people who looked like walking skeletons. British soldiers patrolled the streets, and the air was thick with suspicion and loss. The returning prisoners were processed by Allied authorities, questioned about their time in Canada. Some lied, claiming the Canadians had been cruel, because that was what the officials wanted to hear. Margaret told the truth. "The Canadians treated us well and taught us important things," she said. The man interviewing her marked her file as potentially subversive. The journey home was different for each woman. Margaret arrived in Hamburg to find her old neighborhood half destroyed. Her mother was living in the basement of a bombed-out building. When Margaret walked in, her mother stared at her in disbelief. "Where were you while we starved? You were living with the enemy," she accused. Margaret tried to explain, but her mother called her a collaborator and a traitor. Her brother had died fighting in Russia, and her mother blamed Margaret for surviving. Elise returned to her family's farm in Bavaria. The farm had survived and her parents were alive, but her father refused to talk about the war or the Nazi Party. Elise kept most of her story secret, writing only to Catherine Ross in Canada. Anna reached Berlin to find her entire neighborhood gone, nothing left but rubble. She found distant relatives in the western part of the city, but they looked at her with suspicion. "A prisoner in Canada might be a spy for the Americans now," they whispered. Anna got a job at a damaged hospital, hiding her Canadian cookbook as her only treasure. The hardest lesson was this: the truth they had learned in Canada was not welcome in Germany. The country was broken, starving, and angry. People who had lost everything didn't want to hear about kindness from the enemy. The women who had survived in Canada were seen as outsiders, their experiences dismissed or resented. Margaret worked at a hospital for refugees, using everything she had learned in Medicine Hat, but she kept her Canadian methods quiet. Elise eventually went to nursing school, using Dr. Murphy's letter to build a new career. Anna escaped to West Berlin during the blockade, finding work at an American field hospital, but she never told anyone where she had learned her skills. For all three women, the return to Germany was a test of everything they had become. They had crossed an ocean, survived a war, and discovered that compassion could be stronger than hate. But now, they faced a new challenge: bringing truth to a country built on lies. The years ahead would be hard, but the lessons of Canada would shape their lives forever. As Margaret wrote in her diary, "Strength comes from admitting when you were wrong, not from defending lies." Elise wrote to her Canadian friends, "Compassion is not weakness. It is the only thing that can rebuild what war destroys." Anna, in a letter she never sent, wrote, "I survived, not because I was strong, but because someone chose mercy instead of revenge." The world they returned to was in ruins, but the seeds of change had been planted. The question now was whether those seeds would ever be allowed to grow. The story of Margaret, Elise, and Anna didn't end when they stepped off the ship into the ruins of post-war Germany. In many ways, their real journey was just beginning. The lessons they carried from Canada, lessons of truth, compassion, and the power of kindness, would shape not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. Their experiences became a living legacy, a quiet revolution against the darkness of propaganda and hate. For Margaret, the years after her return were filled with challenges. She worked in a hospital for refugees and displaced people, using every skill she had learned in Medicine Hat. She treated patients with dignity, no matter their background or beliefs. In 1948, a letter arrived from Catherine Ross in Canada, offering to sponsor Margaret's immigration. For months, Margaret wrestled with the decision. Should she leave her homeland behind for a country that had shown her mercy? In 1950, she made her choice. At age 39, she moved to Saskatchewan, joining the staff at Regina General Hospital. There, she became a respected nurse, a mentor, and a living bridge between two worlds. She never married, dedicating her life to healing and to the quiet work of reconciliation. Elise, too, found her calling in the aftermath of war. She stayed in Bavaria, working at a small hospital in the countryside. She used the Canadian nursing methods she had learned, but kept their origin a secret. In 1951, she finally attended a real nursing school, using Dr. Murphy's letter of recommendation. By 1960, she was the head nurse at a teaching hospital in Munich, shaping a new generation of caregivers. In 1952, she married an American soldier and started a family, but she never forgot the kindness she had received in Canada. For decades, she wrote letters to the Canadian family who had welcomed her, and in 1975, she returned to Medicine Hat for a reunion, reconnecting with the people who had changed her life. Anna's path was the hardest. Berlin was divided, dangerous, and full of suspicion. She worked in hospitals under harsh conditions, always using the medical knowledge she had gained in Canada, but never revealing where she had learned it. In 1950, she escaped to West Berlin during the blockade, finding work at an American field hospital. Her skills stood out, and in 1953, she married a German-American soldier and moved to Minnesota. For 30 years, she worked as a nurse in Minneapolis, teaching others the Canadian methods she had mastered. Only in 1987, when she returned to Germany for the first time in nearly 4 decades, did she finally share her story with her daughter, the story of survival, transformation, and the unexpected mercy of former enemies. The legacy of these women reached far beyond their own lives. In 1976, the Canadian government invited former German prisoners back for a reunion in Medicine Hat. 47 people returned, including 8 of the original 27 nurses. The town declared it POW Reconciliation Day, and the hospital unveiled a memorial sign in honor of German nurses who served here 1945 to 1946, proving humanity transcends conflict. Local newspapers covered the event, and students interviewed the former prisoners, eager to understand how enemies could become friends. Historians from the University of Alberta collected diaries, letters, and oral histories, preserving the story for future generations. Margaret, Elise, and Anna all contributed, determined that the truth would not be lost. Margaret said in her interview, "Canada defeated our ideology without firing a shot at us. They fed us, healed us, and showed us a different way. That victory was more complete than any battlefield win." Dr. Murphy, the Canadian surgeon, wrote to his sister, "I lost my brother to German bullets at Juno Beach. I should not be able to forgive, but working next to Nurse Hoffman, I understand she was as much a victim as anyone. Propaganda poisoned a whole generation, and we are breaking that poison with simple kindness." By the 1990s, the story of the Medicine Hat nurses had become a symbol of reconciliation. On the 50th anniversary of the war's end, the last reunion was held at the hospital. Only 12 former prisoners could attend, but Margaret, Elise, and Anna stood together in front of the memorial sign, surrounded by students and journalists. When a young American visitor asked Margaret, "Did you forgive the Canadians for winning the war?" she smiled and replied, "No, I thank them." There is a difference. The lessons of their journey are as relevant today as they were in 1945. In a world still divided by propaganda, suspicion, and fear, the story of the Medicine Hat nurses is a reminder that truth can break the chains of hate, and that compassion is stronger than revenge. When given a chance, humanity chooses healing over harm, understanding over division. Margaret, Elise, and Anna all lived long lives, but before they died, they made sure their stories would not be forgotten. Margaret said, "We came here expecting monsters and found humans. We were told strength means cruelty, but we learned strength means compassion. Canada did not defeat us with weapons. They defeated our lies with truth. That is the victory that lasts." Elise wrote, "Nursing is not about nation or ideology. It is about healing anyone who suffers." That lesson shaped everything I became. Anna said, "In Berlin, I was told Canada was the enemy. In Medicine Hat, they showed me what the real enemy was: propaganda, lies, the ideology that destroyed my country. And they taught me the cure: evidence, kindness, truth." So what does this story mean for us today, especially here in the United States? In a country built on the ideals of freedom, truth, and second chances, the story of the medicine hat nurses is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, compassion can change the world. It's a lesson that echoes through every hospital, every classroom, every community that chooses understanding over hate. The question for all of us is simple. In a world full of division and propaganda, which path will we choose? The kindness that transforms enemies into colleagues, or the cruelty that creates enemies from neighbors? The answer, as Margaret, Elise, and Anna discovered, can change not just a life, but the course of history.